Hello everyone, Professor Bannock here, back with another video taking you through Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. In the last series of videos, we talked about Wittgenstein's ontology, that is his notion of fact, object, world, and reality. Now, we're going to talk about how we think about the world. So moving from ontology to thought, what is the nature of thought? How is it that our thoughts represent reality? And in this sequence of videos, we're going to go through what philosophers following Wittgenstein have called Wittgenstein's picture theory of meaning. That is to say, the meaning of our thoughts pictures reality. Of course, to impute to Wittgenstein a theory is to go against Wittgenstein's own self-conception of what's going on in the Tractatus. That is to say, to show that there are no such thing as philosophical theories. So what is Wittgenstein's picture theory of meaning? Well, it's a contemplation on how it's possible for our thoughts to represent reality, and Wittgenstein is going to use that as a bridge to then talk about language, which will then lead him to talk about the limits of language, and that moves us into those famous latter portions of the Tractatus. But for now, still in Proposition 2, in moving from 2.0 to 2.1, Wittgenstein introduces the notion of a picture. So having established the idea of facts, world, and reality, Wittgenstein now talks about how we think about reality. He says we picture facts to ourselves. And that's going to be the fundamental notion of thought. That when you think, when you have a thought that is in fact well-formed and not just a jumble of nonsense, what you're doing is picturing a fact to yourself. Now we're going to unpack this much more fully, but the first thing to think is that all legitimate thought must be thought about facts. So there will be a question of what the limits of thought are. So in the background, you can think to yourself, we know later in the work, Wittgenstein is going to say that turns out the propositions of the Tractatus were a kind of nonsense. One thing to wonder about is, when you read the Tractatus, which facts are being pictured in the proposition? Maybe there are no facts that correspond to these propositions. Perhaps that's where Wittgenstein is going in trying to outline the limits of all thought. What we do when we think is that we picture facts to ourselves. Elaborating on Proposition 2.1, Wittgenstein says, a picture is a model of reality. So what we do is we model the facts to ourselves when we think. What does that mean? Well, how do models work? They seem to work by arranging the elements of the model in such a way that the arrangement of the elements in the model matches the arrangement of the things being modeled. To understand what Wittgenstein means when he says a picture is a model of reality, we need to understand the two components that make up a picture. He gives us those in 2.13 and moving into 2.15. In 2.13, he says, in a picture, objects have the elements of the picture corresponding to them. Then expanding on that, in a picture, the elements of the picture are the representatives of objects. Moving on to 2.15, he says, the fact that the elements of a picture are related to one another in a determinate way represents that things are related to one another in the same way. Let us call the connection of its elements the structure of a picture. So a picture is composed of two constituents, the elements of it, and the way those elements are arranged, the structure of the elements. Here's an example. Here are some elements that could enter into a picture. Right? These elements are aspects of a picture, and they don't look like anything right now. They don't model anything until I put them into the right order, into the right structure, and then we're going to get the structure of the elements like so. And now we have a model or a picture of a human face just by virtue of arranging these elements in the right kind of order. So these marks on the board here represent or picture a human face because of the way that the elements are arranged, because the eyes are up here about equidistant from the center of the figure, the nose is right about in the center, the mouth down below, the hair above. So the idea here is to ask yourself, how is it that these marks come to represent or picture a human face? For Wittgenstein, the key is the structure between the elements, but more needs to be said about how thoughts are going to be able to picture reality. Here in 2.151, an elaboration on the above 2.15, Wittgenstein defines his crucial notion here, that of pictorial form. Pictorial form is the possibility that things are related to one another in the same way as the elements of the picture. Pictorial form is what makes it possible for one thing to represent another thing. The way my little drawing of a face represented a human face, it's because two things can share the same structure. It's because form is abstractable from its content, and we can have two different sets of content taking on the same form, that representation becomes possible. Pictorial form is, in essence, shared form. Two things having different content but same form, that is the origin of the possibility of representation. One thing represents another thing by virtue of mimicking its form. If two things could not share the same form, then there would be no possibility of representation. And that's indeed what Wittgenstein says in moving on into 2.16 and 2.17. In 2.16, he says, if a fact is to be a picture, it must have something in common with what it depicts. Like when I had the picture of a face on the board, it has to have something in common with a face in order to be a depiction of a face. And what does it have in common? Well, the structure between the elements, the spacing between the eyes, the relation between the eyes and the hair, and the eyes and the nose and the hair. The arrangement of those elements gave a human face, and my little smattering of dots on the ink marks on the board, a common structure, a common pictorial form. We can imagine this as something like Aristotle's old idea that our minds represent reality. Our mind takes on a certain form that is shared in common with the thing that our mind is representing. We take on the form of the thing in our mind, but the mind doesn't take on the content. When my mental state represents the pen, my mental state takes on the form or structure of the pen without taking on the content. My mind doesn't become plastic. My mind just takes the shape or the form of the pen, and in so doing represents the pen. Expanding on that, Wittgenstein foreshadows an important theme as the work continues. A picture cannot depict its pictorial form, it displays it. That is to say, a picture cannot tell you its form, you just have to look at the picture and see its form. The idea will ultimately be that in language we cannot describe this form or structure of language. Language can only show its form or structure. If we try to depict the form or structure of language in language, we would just be using that structure over again in order to depict it. So that's where our ability to represent runs out of steam. We cannot represent form, we can only see form. Form can only show itself to us in the structure of our picture or our representation. We can think about this by going back to our picture of a human face. This picture represents a human face because of the arrangement of the elements. This we can see is supposed to correspond to a mouth. We can see that this is supposed to correspond to a nose, all because that's put into the right shape. If I had dots and a triangle thing and a loop here and I had them all mixed up, we would not therein see the image of a human face. Now suppose I tried to depict the structure of this image in a new image. The best I can do is just, let's see, kind of redraw the image, right? Notice the best I can do to articulate the structure of these elements is to simply show them in my picture, to show the structure of the elements in my picture. And if I try to depict the structure of the elements, I would just get the picture back. One way to put the point is that we cannot represent the representational mechanism itself. That which enables us to represent cannot itself be represented. It's kind of like, imagine you lived in a world where everything was pre-recorded ahead of time. The only thing that is not pre-recorded is the pre-recording itself. Similarly, the only thing that is not represented is the representation itself. In 2.2, we get a sense of Wittgenstein's very stripped down theory of linguistic meaning. Remember, we're asking ourselves what linguistic meaning is, how thoughts represent the world. And in 2.2, Wittgenstein is telling us that we're going to get this with a minimal set of ingredients. He's not going to introduce the notion of a thinking substance or a thinking subject. Get rid of that. There is no thinking subject. And the medium of our thoughts are going to be the facts themselves. No abstract entities called meanings necessary in order to develop a theory of meaning. A picture depicts reality by representing a possibility of existence and non-existence of states of affairs. Notice, the ingredients that Wittgenstein is using to build up thought don't include a subject and don't include some medium of thought that the subject is able to traverse. It all comes back to the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. So remember, in the previous sequence of videos, Wittgenstein's highly stripped down ontology. All there are objects arranged into relations that create states of affairs, and representation is just going to be another set of facts alongside the other facts that represent the other facts. That's what he means in 2.221 when he says what a picture represents is its sense. To see what's at stake in Wittgenstein's consideration of thought here, you might have thought that in order to come up with a full account of the nature of thought, we'd have to include talk of the thinking subject, the person having the thoughts, the medium of their thoughts. My thoughts are not the same as reality, so we're distinguishing between the medium of my thoughts or the sense of my thoughts and the state of affairs targeted. Right? So we have a subject who has a thought, the cactus grows, and somehow that semantic medium of thought targets the state of affairs in the world. And essentially what Wittgenstein is going to do is try to cook up a notion of thought where we don't make any reference to the thinking subject, and we don't really need this separate realm of thought and sense. It's all going to come down to the state of affairs or the facts, and the ways that the facts can share their structure with other facts, thereby making that other fact a representation of the fact. So the sense of a linguistic phrase is the very state of affairs that it depicts. If it doesn't depict any state of affairs, then it doesn't have a sense. So when you're thinking later on in the Tractatus, when Wittgenstein calls the Tractatus itself a book full of nonsense, ask yourself, are there facts that are being depicted in the Tractatus?